All right, looking at the matter of losing biblical awe. And we're looking at the matter of, well, we closed last week at the top of page 3 that says, when a man comes to a proper belief in God, it relieves him of about 10,000 other problems. In other words, once we learn to think properly about God, then other issues will automatically, or should automatically, we might say, fall into place. It reminds me of a statement that was made, and I believe it was Brother Gus Nichols, or it may have been someone else, but someone had not missed a single service of the church, Sunday or Wednesday. Of course, obviously, being in good health is critical for that. But the point was, had not missed a single service in 50 or 60, 70 years, something like that. And the question was asked about it, and how does one do it? And the response was, when I became a Christian, whether or not I was going to assemble with God's people was settled. In other words, I didn't have to think Sunday morning if I was going to get up and go to Sunday school. I didn't have to worry. I didn't have to stop and think, am I going to come back Sunday night? Am I going to be there on Wednesday night? When I obeyed the gospel, that decision was made, and I never had to think about it ever again. And that's the type of thing that, again, it doesn't mean that there aren't difficulties that follow us in our lives, etc. But when we have a proper view of God, you're not going to have to decide whether or not you're going to go to services. Obviously, if you're sick. And so those are the types of things that solve themselves when we have a proper view of God. It's almost like in Malachi 1 and Malachi 3, where they were offering God tainted animals that were sick, animals that were blind, animals that were lame. And the prophet said, offer those to the king and see what he says. In other words, bring this sorry offering to the king and see what he thinks about it. And the point was, you would never bring that sorry sacrifice to the king because you fear the king. And yet you turn around and offer to God what you would not offer to the king. So who do you have a higher regard for? Well, then the answer is obvious. I have a higher regard for the king than I do for God, because I'll give this to God, but I'd never think about giving it to the king. And so, again, improper view of God. An improper view of God. And so having the right belief about God relieves us of a lot of difficulties. Then in point 4, which is what we're going to pick up, says, when idolatry, by the way, idolatry is any way of wrong thinking about God. Anything that we think about God that misrepresents Him and His holiness and His character is idolatry. Because He ceases to be the God that is revealed in the Bible, and He becomes some other God. All right? And so when idolatry is transferred from one member's heart into the hearts of other members in the congregation, it's ultimately transferred to the entire congregation. And it says, the first step down for any church is taken when it surrenders its high opinion of God. The masses of her adherents come to believe that God is different from what He actually is, and that is heresy of the most insidious and deadly kind. And so it's a creeping ill, it's a creeping danger to think less of God than we ought. And that type of thinking is pervasive. It's like leaven. In other words, it started with one member, it goes to other members, and then ultimately infects an entire congregation. Now, at the bottom of page 3, the question is asked, have you given serious thought to the God of your beliefs? And the opening question was, how do you imagine God? How well do you know God? And those are very serious matters to consider. When you think of God, what do you think of? And how do you view God? I preached a series of sermons a few years ago on the false gods of men and the ideas that people have about God that are just not accurate. For example, that God the Father, I think I use this terminology, is some type of galactic grandpa. You know, they think about God as some kind of great grandpa up in the sky that just lives to give gifts to his children, and he doesn't rebuke them, and he never, you know, he thinks their sins are cute. You know, he thinks their rebellion is cute, and that's what a lot of people, you know, how a lot of people view their children and their grandchildren. And they transfer those ideas to God, and that's a false idea of God. Or they think about Jesus as being some kind of beatnik or some kind of hippie, you know, just wandered around and it was always all good, you know, peace, man, you know, and that Jesus, you know, Jesus was cool with everything, and people have that idea of Jesus. And by the way, you read about 2 chapters in the book of John before that one will get knocked out of your head. You know, to have a proper view. And while people have improper views of God and of Jesus, because they hadn't read their Bibles. You know, if you don't know God, then you formulate your own opinions and ideas about God. And when you haven't read your Bible, you can't know God, because that's how God reveals himself to us, is in the Scriptures. And you know, people talk about, you know, God is awesome. What do you mean by awesome? Do you mean awesome in the sense that it's like a rock concert, which is what a lot, or awesome in the sense that when you think about God, it fills you with awe and makes your knees knock together? See, the word awesome means a whole lot of different things, doesn't it? But most people want to think about God and worship like some kind of rock concert. You know, it's awesome. You know, I read this foolish garbage on Facebook all the time. God really showed out today. You know, they come home from worship. God really showed out today. Well, what did he do? Tell me what he did. Just because somebody had a hot ripping guitar solo in the worship service, so God showed out. You know, is that what that means? That's what they think it means. You know, and so, you know, people just have these perverted ideas of who God is and what God does, and it's idolatrous. It's idolatrous, and so we want to have a proper view of God. Now, looking on page 4 to think about the way God is viewed today. Under number 3 there at the top says, visit many church worship services on Sunday morning. You will likely find a congregation comfortably relating to a deity who fits nicely with their precise doctrinal positions, lends almighty support to their social crusades, and who is exactly what they desire in their spiritual experiences, but there is an absence of awe. And so I think that's a fair statement that we want to be comfortable with God, and we don't want God to make us uncomfortable. And we don't, and maybe that's one reason we don't read our Bibles enough, is because when we start reading those things, they make us uncomfortable. And we see how God dealt with people in the Old Testament and even in the New, and we're not comfortable with that. We're not comfortable with the concept of surrender. We're not comfortable with the concept of submission. And so, therefore, because these things make us uncomfortable, then we're going to stay away from those types of things. Stay away from the reading and the study that brings those ideas to the forefront. And then right under that it says, reverence and awe have been replaced by a yawn of familiarity. I thought about this, looking at this, that if any one of us had an opportunity, for example, to go and visit the Oval Office, to walk into the Oval Office, I mean, I think any red-blooded American ought to want to see would be in awe to visit the Oval Office, right? Because that's where all the presidents, that's where their desk is, that's where many of the decisions are made, whatever. But the Oval Office represents something, right? And to go there would be a great honor, and to walk in there for the first time would just be incredible. But what if you worked at the White House? What if you were an assistant to the president and you walked in that office every single day, maybe 3, 4, 5 times a day? What happens? What happens to it? It loses its specialness. You know, it loses in other words, the awe is gone. The awe is gone, and we come into danger with that attitude with God. That we have this idea that, okay, we're here, you know, God is here, and we'll be back, and God will be here, and we just do this over and over again, and we lose that sense of being awestruck by being in the presence of God. Now, it takes work to maintain that sense of awe. And it takes reading, it takes study, it takes reflection, and that's why this is so difficult for so many of us. Under letter C, I love the quote here. And by the way, of all people who made it is John Calvin. It says, "The human mind is, so to speak, a perpetual forge of idols." And then skip down 2 lines. "The human mind dares to imagine a God suited to its own capacity. It substitutes vanity and an empty phantom in the place of God. The mind in this way conceives the idol, and the hand gives it birth." In other words, the God that we serve with our hands is a God that was first formed in our minds. And by the way, of all people, Calvin was as guilty of this as any. You know, Calvin created an image of God that in no way reflects the God of the Bible. Calvin's God says that everybody before they were ever born was predestined to heaven or hell, and nothing that they can do or say will ever change that. That's not God. I mean, the Calvinists will tell you, all right? The Calvinists will tell you that God is glorified in the murder of infants. Because everything that man does is ordained specifically by God. So whatever man does glorifies God, whether he is worshiping or whether he's slaughtering babies. Now, I don't want any part of that God. But that's Calvin's God. And it's an idol. And Calvinists hold slavishly to John Calvin's idol that he calls God. And I don't want any part of that God. You can't read about that God in the pages of Scripture. You can read about it in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which he wrote about 500 years ago. Calvin did, but you can't read about him in the Bible. And so even his God is the result of his own imaginations, because nobody ever thought or taught anything about God remotely akin to what Calvin taught for 1,500 years. So if I can't find Calvin's God for 1,500 years until Calvin reveals him to us in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, then I know Calvin's God's an idol. What do you say, John?
First he has a problem with trust, submission, and he has to have a certain amount of control.
Yeah.
That's what that proves.
Yeah.
He has to have control of some of it.
And they think God has to have his finger in absolutely everything in order for him to be God. For example, they don't think that God knows everything because God is all-knowing. They think God is all-knowing because God has already written the script for everything. In other words, God has already scripted out every thought, every word, every deed in the life of every human being, every animal, every insect. God has personally scripted everything that's going to happen until the end of time. And therefore, that's why God knows everything, because he's already written the script. Well, you know what? My God doesn't have to write the script to know everything. Calvinists think their God is more holy and more powerful than ours, and I think that's not powerful at all. That's like me writing a computer program and then predicting what the end result is when you start entering the data. Right? If I write the program, I already know what? I know what the outcome's going to be. And that's Calvin's God. That's Calvin's God. That's an idolatrous form of God that is in no way represented by the Scriptures. Then you have at the bottom of page 4. It says, "To be honest, many have accepted a concept of the God of the Bible and whittled it down to a manageable proportion. They refashion God to fit their expectations, serve their desires. Thus God becomes the patron of a specific political party, overruling cause, specific belief. Modern man has exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for a God, lowercase g, that is more convenient in his selfish perspectives. Thus, biblical awe is lost. And so, and then on page 5, there's a list starting on page 5 that goes over to the middle of or top of page 6. And what this is Kakelman, the brother that wrote this book, was taking notes from another supposed brother's statements, either a sermon or whatnot. And here are some of the things that this supposed brother had to say about God, particularly as it pertains to the matter of worship. And so you look at like number 1. Humans are capable of expressing worship toward God by a variety of emotional and physical responses. That is true. The question is, are we authorized to do that? The question is not, are we capable of doing? The question is, what are we authorized to do? I mean, we can do a lot of things, right? We can do a lot of different things and call it worship. You know, we can dance, yodel. I mean, just fill in the blank. The question is, am I authorized to do those things? So it's not a matter of capability, it's a matter of authority. But then look at number 2. By the way, this is all the same person, okay? This all this claptrap is coming out of the same mouth. All right, just so you know. It says, each of us will see God differently, to seek to worship him differently. It is my belief, and there's the problem right there. It is my belief that God has given to each of us a personality type that seeks to worship him different from other personality types. Now, you can believe that all you want, but you'll never find it in the Scriptures. But then I want to show you something here in this particular paragraph. Listen to what it says. It says, David could dance naked before the ark as an act of worship. Abraham would give God 10% of his booty. Hannah would give her son. Mary would worship him by pouring expensive perfume on his feet and washing it with her hair. Our God enjoys spontaneous, loving, heartfelt responses of any nature, as long as they are authentic. All right? Now look, anytime you start dealing with leftists in the church, they're going to start playing loose with the Scriptures. David did not dance naked before the ark. All right? The Bible clearly says he was wearing a linen ephod. Now, he was not wearing his kingly garments, and he was not wearing particularly garments that were suitable for a man to wear in public, because there were certain requirements of modesty, and David ignored those requirements. Now, but to say David danced naked before the ark is just to play foolishly with the Scriptures. He did no such thing. And by the way, his own wife rebuked him for it. And probably rightfully so. The Bible doesn't say that David was approved when he did that. And the Bible just expresses it as a matter of historical fact. It doesn't say God was happy with it. And certainly Micah's response would have indicated that David's actions were inappropriate. But just because the Bible records a thing doesn't mean that God approves of that thing. And so he's playing loose with the Scriptures. Abraham gave God 1/10 of the spoils of war. Well, the Bible says he gave it to Melchizedek. I mean, if you just want to see what the text says Abraham gave Melchizedek 1/10 of the spoils. Now, do I think in some way that was an action that was in some way directed toward God? Yes, I do. But again, playing loose with the text. How in the world is Hannah dedicating her son to God an act of worship? See, if you want to just loose yourselves from the moorings of the text, you can say or believe anything you want, and that's the problem. That's the problem of such things. Then, and number 3, it says David's responses came from the heart. He did what his heart told him to do, and it was acceptable to God because it was authentic. So whatever your heart tells you to do is okay. Can you read that in the Bible? The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, and who can know it? Jeremiah 17:9. He who trusts in his own heart is a fool. Proverbs 28:26. Let me ask you this. What's that? Following his heart gave him a lot of problems. That's exactly right. The thing about, and that's where I was going with this, Sean, is was David's desire to build a temple for God a heartfelt desire? Was it heartfelt? Was it authentic? Did he really want to do it? Did he have good intentions to do it? Answer to all those things? Yes, yes, and yes. What did Nathan tell him? Go and do all that your heart desires, for the Lord is with you. His own preacher even said that. And then what did God tell Nathan? No, you go tell David. Since you're the one that told him to go build it, now you go tell him not to build it. But here's the key. The key to that statement is, God said to Nathan, says, at what time did I ever tell you to build me a house? That's the question. He said, my ark, my altar, or the ark, has dwelt in tents from the time I called Israel out of Egypt. Hundreds of years, okay? He said, my ark has dwelt in a tabernacle, in a tent. He says, but at what time did I ask you the question, why haven't, because see, David built himself a house of cedar. And that was the statement that came out of David's mouth. Here I dwell in a house of cedar, and the Lord's house lives in a tent. So when God speaks to Nathan, he said, when did I ever tell you, why have you not built me a house of cedar? In other words, the Lord's like saying, if I'd have wanted one, I'd have told you. If that's what I wanted, that's what I would have told you. And because I never rebuked you for not building me one, then that tells you what? I didn't want one. That's not my plan. And so David's actions, David's heart was authentic. It was sincere. By the way, David, as recorded in the Chronicles, it was said that, or in 1 Kings says, nevertheless, it was good that it was in your heart. In other words, God commended him for his heart. He commended him for his desire. But the desire of his heart was not authority to do what he wanted to do. And so that's what we find. So whenever we make God the 100% receiver of whatever I want to do, who becomes God? I do. When the moment I say that whatever I want to do makes God happy, I've quit letting God be God, and I've made myself to be God. And there ain't no other way around it. There's no other way around it. Let me ask you this one. What about when Israel had the golden calf constructed in Exodus 32? Was that authentic? It was authentic, right? They said, this man Moses, we don't know what's happened to him. Aaron, we need you to fix us up something. And by the way, once they built that calf, Aaron said, tomorrow's going to be a feast day to the Lord. A feast day to the Lord. So it was authentic, right? It was heartfelt, right? And God He accepted it, right? God was happy as he could be. Man, I love that golden calf. That thing's awesome. That's exactly what he said, right? Or did a bunch of guys lose their life over that? Did a bunch of people get killed? Did the sons of Levi, the preachers, gird up their swords and kill a bunch of people over that? Several thousand died because of that. Because of their heartfelt, authentic worship. So, again, what had they done? In this case, they put their idolatry into specific form. Bottom of page 5. Whenever it comes to pleasing God, the requisite is we need to express joy. God is happy with each individual's efforts to worship Him. Now, you show me where you can read that one in the Bible. Ask Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10. about their worship to God. Ask Jesus about Matthew 15 when he quoted Isaiah and said, "In vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men." You know, there's the false will worship of Colossians chapter 2. I mean, this is just foolishness. It's not only unbiblical, it's anti-biblical. And so this kind of mess has crept into the church in a large. Look, we already know that the religious world is eat up with idolatry. It's eat up with this type of idolatry that says whatever I want to do, God is happy with it as long as I'm sincere in doing it. The religious world at large is eat up with this kind of idolatry, but it's found its way. It's found its way in many places into the church. Last thing I'll mention, I was on page 6. This one just killed me. This one just killed me. Look at number 7 there at the top of page 6. My task is to do what I think God wants me to be pleasing to Him, or wants of me to be pleasing to Him, and let that right be the same for the next guy. My task is to do what I think. What I think. Now that is a sure path to perdition if there ever was one. I'll do what I think. Okay. Well, what happened when Abraham decided he'd do what he thought? What happened to Abraham? By the way, what happened to the rest of the world because of Abraham? Because he thought he's going to help God out. Because he'd been waiting too long. It's been 13 years. It's been 13 years since God made His promise, so Abraham's going to help God. What about Naaman? 2 Kings chapter 5. When he went to the man of God, and the man of God didn't even come to the door, sent his servant, said, "Go dip 7 times in the Jordan and your leprosy will be cured." He said, the Bible says he was incensed. And the first words out of his mouth, he said, "Behold, I thought." What'd you think, Naaman? Well, I thought that the prophet of God would come out and strike his hands across the sky and heal the leper. So he had it all worked out in his mind before he got there, exactly how it was going to go down. And it didn't go down like he thought. And he went away in a rage, the Bible said. But you know how else he went away? A leper. He went away in a rage, and he went away as a leper. Until, and by the way, we don't want to be hard on Naaman, because apparently this guy was loved by everybody that knew him. I mean, it was an Israelite servant girl, a slave girl, who wanted him to be clean. And his own company of men who had accompanied him on this trip pleaded with him. They pleaded with him. My father, if the prophet had told you to go out and do some great thing, you would have done it. Why not do this simple thing? And he was convinced. And he went down, and says he went, and he dipped, and he got exactly what he came for. So we don't want to be too hard on Naaman. But as long as Naaman was pursuing what he thought, Naaman was going to end up as a leper. Until he let his thinking, until he let God's thinking become his thinking. And when he let God's thinking become his thinking, he got the blessings. He got the blessings that God could provide. All right. Now on page 6, looking at Israel as an example. 3 things, and we talked about this last week, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. This is the account from the Exodus out of Egypt, the giving of the 10 commandments, and then Moses going back up into the mountain to get the rest of the law, and the incident with the golden calf. And it says Israel's loss resulted from 3 steps. Bottom page 6. 1, she lost her awe of the Almighty. I mean, the very people who stood and watched the lightning and heard the thunder and the earthquakes and the smoke The very people that said, do not let, Moses, whatever you do not let God talk to us. Because if God talks to us, we are dead. We're dead. Went from that to make us a God out of this gold. Make us a God. Because we don't know what's happened to this. You know that guy Moses that we wanted to speak to us for God? Well, we don't know what happened to him. So let's go a different route. Let's get us an idol, something we can see, something we can put our hands on, something we can bow down before. They lost their awe of God. Number 2, top of page 7. They were impatient with God's silence. In other words, Moses was gone longer than they thought he should have been. The Bible says, when Moses was delayed from coming down from the mount. In other words, they wanted God to work on their time schedule. And if there's anything that men need to understand is that God doesn't work on man's time schedule. What we think is a long time is less than a blink of the eye to God. I mean, Peter illustrated this in 2 Peter chapter 3. It says that in the last days there will come scoffers, saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the creation of the world, all things continue as they have. In other words, well, if Jesus hadn't come back by now, he must not be coming at all. That's the idea. Where's the promise of his coming? We waited. By the way, at most they probably could have waited 25 years. I mean, they could have been Christians 25 years. Maybe 30 at the tops. And so, because God hadn't come back, because God hadn't sent Jesus back in 30 years, then the whole thing's just got to be scrapped, right? Isn't that right? That's the attitude. It's just been too, it's kind of like, when I was young, for example, when I was a teenager, I'd have never guessed I'd live to be as old as I am even right now. You know why? Because that's way too long for God to wait to come back. That was my thinking. I couldn't imagine myself being as old as my grandpa at that time. Because that's just way too long. Now that's just the foolishness of youth. That's just that's youthful thinking. The thinking of inexperience. And by the way, when you're young, everything has to come right then. You're 12, but you can't wait to be a teenager. You get to be 13, and you got to get to 15 so you can get your permit. And then you got to get to 18, and then you got to get to 21. There's all these age, and they just can't get here soon enough. It's always got to be right in front of you. Well, and yet here I am, and now here I am, and I'm thinking about the prospect of living another 30 years. If the Lord's good to me, I get to live another 30 years. And I'm already thinking along those lines. Maybe even 40. Maybe even 40 years. I mean, that's not out. I mean, living to my 90s is not out of the realm of possibility, is it? People can live to their 90s, can't they, Miss Beulah? Okay, I'm just checking. And so, and the older we get, the more we understand God's not going to work on our time. You're not going to put the stopwatch on God. God's going to work in his time. God predicted that he was going to send his son in Genesis 3, and it took 4,000 years for that to come around. And just because God hasn't sent his son back in the 2,000 years since he ascended into heaven doesn't mean that he's not sending him back at all. So we want to be patient. We don't want to be impatient with what we perceive to be God's silence. And then number 3 is she allowed individualism to rule. Make us, we do not know what has happened to him. In other words, now all of a sudden it's all about what we want. It's all about what we want. They felt like they needed to be in complete control of the situation. And so then the last line there says, Israel pressed the fact that it had the right to make personal demands about the kind of God he or she desired. That's when we start talking like that, we presume that we have the right to make God in our image, which is the thrust of the whole book. And then on the bottom of page 7, the church is losing its awe today. Even in the Garden of Eden, I hadn't ever thought about this, but in the Garden of Eden, idolatry was a problem because Satan used the fruit as a lure, saying that you'll be like God. The day you eat, God knows that you'll be like Him. You'll be like Him. And so, and the text is clear that she saw that the tree was good for food. It was pleasant to the eyes, good for food, and desire to make one wise. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, all tied up there in one. That's 1 John 2:15. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, these things are not of the Father but of the world. And that's exactly what grabbed a hold of Eve, those three things. In the bottom of page 7, people have now made science their God. They think that science can answer everything. And they think that science is omnipotent to explain everything. And yet, there is not anything remotely akin to a consensus on how the universe got here. You ever thought about that? Science can answer everything, but they can't even decide on how everything got here. Science can answer everything, and yet there are some who know that Darwinian evolution is so insufficient to explain as a creative mechanism that Darwinian evolution is unbelievably insufficient to explain the variety of what we have of life on earth, that some of them adopted a crazy idea which was known as punctuated equilibrium. Now what that is that all at one time things changed from one to another instead of gradually changing, because they knew evolution wouldn't work that way. In essence, said a snake laid a nest full of eggs and half of them hatched out as birds. In other words, we know this won't explain it, so let's just come up with another nonsensical explanation. But if science is such a great explanatory mechanism, then how come all of these things are still of absolutely no consensus in the scientific community? And they say, well, we just hadn't found it yet. We just hadn't found it yet. It's just unbelievable. But in other words, we're going to hold on. We're going to hold on to these things that we know obviously are not true, because we absolutely cannot allow anyone to believe in God. That's what it boils down to. And so, and I made a correction down on number 2 at the bottom, page 7. This is where we'll stop. It says the scientific revolution has pushed God into the shadows of life. The unknown answers which belong to God are crowded out by a flood of facts and measurable data, and God has been forced into retirement as totally unnecessary. I disagree with that statement. It's not been pushed out by facts and data. It's been pushed out by theories and assumptions. Theories and assumptions. There is still no proof for Darwinian evolution. None. There's still not an iota of proof that man is the descendant of primates. We didn't come, we're not a bunch of hairless monkeys, which is what Darwinian evolution would make us out to be. There's just no evidence for it. And yet, it's been forced down our kids' throats in many places, around the country. And so it's not facts and data, it's theories and assumptions. And, as Aldous Huxley said, we looked for reasons not to believe in God, because we didn't want God's moral restrictions on us. And he said explicitly, he said, we wanted our sexual freedom, and faith in God prohibited us from exploring and exercising what we wanted as uninhibited sexual freedom. Therefore, we looked for reasons not to believe in God, and subsequently, it was easy to find them. So he gave the whole thing away from the start. We didn't like what God had to say about sexual purity. And so therefore, rather than just deny that, rather than saying, well, God says this, but we don't want to do it, we'll just say God doesn't exist. And that's the way that it's been working for a long time. All right, Lord willing, next week we will start on page 8. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the number 3, but it's on page 8.